I'll start over here. And I'll also try to avoid prolonged interventions, kind of.
Thank you very much for your fascinating presentation. My quick question is really about sort of the main individuals that you would say are involved in this story, because I think with the overview you gave, we learn about the key states, and in particular, if you could sort of highlight which particular individuals were most influential, I'm wondering how were they persuasive? What kinds of arguments did they advance that got others who were more reluctant to change their minds?
Yeah, okay. So there's actually a whole range of actors that one could study if one went into greater detail with some of the countries, like the contribution by the Philippines already from the 40s all the way up through the 60s until the coup by Ferdinand Marcos. There were several very interesting legal diplomats. I decided to focus more on this Jamaica story and try to figure out the story and the background of a diplomat like Egerton Richardson, who has a very interesting story, but it's very hard to find out much about him. He's also a very private person, so he hasn't left many sources. I've been speaking, emailing with his children and interviewed people in Jamaica just to gather more stuff, because it's very clear that he's a very refined intellectual and has this kind of way of handling international diplomacy, where he's also in some ways trying to invent Jamaican foreign policy as he moves from Jamaica in August '62 to New York and have to act in that scene. But what is clear, and I was helped very much by a study done by an American sociologist on the values of Jamaican leaders who had surveyed them in the late 50s and 60s and written a book about them in '64. So I actually had a lot of statistical data kind of on general values, how they read, for example, the Cold War issues of choosing between the Soviet Union and the US. They always chose the Western side. They were always Western line, but they were critiquing the US because of racial issues. And then looking at the intellectual context, his mentor was Norman Manley, who was one of the in some ways, the founding father of Jamaica in parallel to his political rival. And when you look at some of his writings, he was a very highly qualified lawyer, politician, and he discussed issues of the relationship between law and civilization in the 50s and the role of lawyers in the international affairs. And he was the politician who, in a sense, led this introduction of these sanctions policy. So it's very clear that they had a very good grasp of international affairs. But this Egerton Richardson was of African descent. He was always held back during the colonial power to really fulfill his potential. He didn't have any education beyond high school until he, in his early 40s, gets a grant to go to Oxford. So it's merit that drives this man. It's not privilege or high education. And then at the end, before independence, he becomes permanent secretary in the Ministry of Finance, which is the top civil servant, so very strong. But that's mentored by Norman Manley. So and it's in a context where there's some really fascinating thinkers, especially around development economics and economics of poverty. So it's a rich tradition in this kind of relatively small Caribbean setting that these characters emerge from. But very skilled in this. And again, it's different stories if you look at Ghana, if you look at Liberia, if you look at Costa Rica, but somehow they link up. And refined, courageous, but also with the guts to actually challenge the big powers. Yeah, so, okay. Yeah, Claude?
Thank you for a very fascinating presentation. I would like to ask you about Samuel Moyn. Mm-hmm. He spoke in this room about a year ago, and Samuel Moyn seems to say something like, before the 1970s, not much had happened. Mm-hmm. And then you make a total twist of that statement, and you say that very much happened in the 1960s. Yeah. How would you assess Samuel Moyn's assessment of the 1970s as a decisive point in history of modern human rights?
Yeah, okay. So I started on this project just around the time that Samuel Moyn's book, The Last Utopia, came in 2010. And I was actually at a conference in Freiburg, which he organized with another historian called Jan Eckel. And I had worked on my project for about 2 months. I'd been in the UN sources, and everybody, like 30 historians, was focusing on the 1970s. And I had seen that there was something going on in the 60s, so I decided I'll go my own way. So throughout the whole process, I have, in a sense, defined my project up against his work. And that has been a very constructive engagement, I think, because at one point, he has forced us to ask new questions to the history of human rights. That's very clear. The way, in a sense, I write about the 40s here is reassessing some of the very positive people like Marianne Glendon, who wrote about A World Made New, with his critiques, and then finding a new synthesis. But in many ways, I think he's fundamentally rebooted human rights historiography. And that is an important contribution by any merit. His actual history, then I'm very skeptical towards the way it played out. And he's, I call it Big Bang historiography, the way he kind of situates the 70s as that point where it started. But I've had several good interactions with him over the years, and he's also the series editor. He's the one who secured me my book deal. So he's also been very supportive of my work because he wants to kind of ask these questions and challenge us in our understanding of this. And then I also, like he says, well, the New York Times in 1977, all this kind of the mentions of human rights took off, kind of skyrocketed. And then when I was in Jamaica, I started counting how many mentions of human rights was there in the leading newspaper, the Jamaica Gleaner, in 1968, and I counted 191. So it's kind of also, it's a little bit more playful, trying to situate kind of, but it's also about which sources we look at, who we consult at different stages of this history. And there I think his book is a polemic, but when you're trying to write a history, kind of, then it loses out on really some key elements in this process. And I very much disagree with his understanding of the anti-colonial movements not being human rights movements, because I don't think you can describe them as one monolithic category, because we're talking about so many countries and several continents, and we have to write through all of these nuances, and that's what I tried, kind of by bringing up all these also individual stories of countries. And these are important stories for Jamaica to understand, that they were at once at the vanguard of some of these issues, when they're also now rediscovering what they should do on human rights, because they haven't created a National Human Rights Commission yet. They're discussing it, and I gave them, look, here's the parliamentary papers from 1968 when you discussed this issue. You've been waiting for 46 years, 48 now. So it can help stimulate a different discussion in some of these settings, and I think I'm happy to be part of that, and we can't do that with Samuel Moyn's book, because it doesn't acknowledge that story. So, anyone else here?
Yeah, thanks a lot for a very interesting talk tonight, some great information. My question has to do with, while this was all going on during the 50s and 60s, was there any impact domestically on some of these countries because of the discussion that was going on at the UN and internationally? And I have a self-serving question for this, really, because I've done some work on the 57 Civil Rights Act in the United States, the first civil rights legislation passed since Reconstruction. And one of the driving forces behind that, besides Lyndon Johnson, was Dean Acheson. Mm-hmm. And Acheson argued that we had to do this because when foreign diplomats came to the United States and couldn't stay in a hotel in DC because they were from Africa or India, we have to do something about this.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think that's a kind of a very powerful threat that continues into the 1960s, when more and more of these foreign diplomats arrive, and it's like maybe 10% of the housing in DC in the early 60s was desegregated. So you had like Guinean diplomats living in, quote, rat-infested lodgings. I've found that in the Lyndon Johnson archive. And it became, in some ways it was already that around the court case on Brown versus Board of Education. Look at some of the interventions from the federal government. It was a Cold War issue. But they're still struggling in the 60s to find a way of engaging, and the Kennedy administration is struggling because they're just inheriting the legacy of the Eisenhower administration of pulling out of the international work on codifying or drafting these covenants. So in some ways, they're being guided in by the significance and this push from global South states. So it's a gradual process for the US to engage in the legal diplomacy project. But of course, the politics, they play out in different ways. And when you look at what the US tried in the early 50s to simply cut down what I call this normative political food chain around especially work on discrimination, it's very different what they do in the early 60s, opening up and engaging with the new African states. The Kennedy administration does that, but it takes time for them to find their feet in the human rights diplomacy. So yeah, I hope that's fairly something of a response. Asle?
Well, thank you very much for a stimulating talk. I would like to go back into the 1970s. Mark Metzauer, one of the colleagues of Samuel Moyn at Columbia, wrote a book called Governing the World, and I'm going to totally butcher the main theme of the book, but his view is that the power of the powerless, human rights, and other international agreements very quickly becomes the power of the powerful, and that's when the great powers get on board with the agenda and totally corrupts it for their own purposes. And in that light, would you care to comment about how the efforts made by countries such as Liberia and Jamaica in the 1960s, how that actually filtered into the negotiations over the Helsinki protocols? Okay. How much of this agenda was left intact, or was there a rupture?
Okay, all right. So one of the things that I noticed when I was reading through the literature on the Helsinki Final Act and the human rights elements was nobody really explained where the human rights entered into this. It was very much presented as, it came during the negotiation process from 72 to 75, or it really only came after when the US administration from 77 picked it up and ran with it. And I wasn't quite satisfied with that explanation, and because it had to come from somewhere. I mean, we're talking about diplomacy, we're talking about norms, we're talking about kind of and the way this influences or informs politics. And what struck me, I read this book by Daniel C. Thomas called The Helsinki Effect, and he completely misreads this 1970 UN Declaration on Friendly Relations Among States and Friendly Relations and Peaceful Relations Among States. I can't remember the full title. He says there's no human rights mention in that declaration. And I found it, I think, 4 different places in the text, and it specifically refers to racial discrimination and religious intolerance. So that legal process, which happened outside the formal human rights structures, but in the legal committee of the UN, actually was a synthesis of this human rights debate in the 1960s. And when you look at the design of that declaration, and especially the what's called, it gets a little technical now, Basket 1 in the Helsinki Final Act, which is, in a sense, has a similar title. These are the principles of relations among states. It actually, that Article 7 on human rights links to this. The template of these so when you read them like this, knowing that the 70 document is a synthesis of what happened in the 60s, suddenly you look at that. And then you look at the actual language of the human rights principle in the Helsinki Final Act, and it talks about human rights and fundamental freedoms, including freedom of thought, conscience, and religion, which is specifically then focusing on the religious freedom aspect. Again, a link to the 1960s. But what happens at the UN in parallel to Helsinki Final Act? The Western states, Sweden, Netherlands, they reopen the discussion over an international legal instrument on religious intolerance. So they have this almost like a 2-track diplomacy, the Helsinki, and then open it at the UN in 72 and 73 to try and push concessions there. So when you start looking at these, you have a context where you can actually say there is a route. And also because the European structures of human rights, the regional mechanism of the Council of Europe, did not have any authority to influence the Helsinki process. The UN was, in a sense, an international organization where they could bring some of these principles in, and they did. You can see that in negotiations. So it's quite a subtle reading, but I had to kind of say Daniel Thomas got it wrong, and you've kind of artificially disconnected the 70s process from the 60s. And there is a way of how the Helsinki Final Act draws on a legacy of 60s human rights diplomacy, with then religion being a key kind of key entry point as well, because that was an important way of kind of using human rights to target the type of reform that was wanted behind the Iron Curtain. I hope that was fairly clear. So, Gaia, from the start.
Thank you very much for a very interesting lecture, and I was very pleased to hear what you had to say on Samuel Moyn, because I think your approach is more reasonable. But you overdid it a bit, because I'm wondering about your approach to the 1960s and the role of the emerging new majority in the UN, Africa and Asia. Because, I mean, this was a very complex movement. I mean, you talked about Bandung. We should never forget that China is present at Bandung. China was certainly not a human rights activist. And most of these countries were not really democracies, at least in a more traditional Western sense. So I wondered, I think you have to separate very clearly, and I haven't read your book, maybe you do it in your book, but what they primarily meant was, of course, racism. They were absolutely against racism, 100%. And they were absolutely against colonialism. And I wondered if you kind of, whether you distinguish clearly enough between these two very strong and very important elements and human rights in a more specific traditional sense, because I have my doubts about the extent to which the movement as such pushed so hard for traditional human rights. Some of the countries, it was wonderful with Jamaica. I mean, they outdo the Nordic countries. I mean, small countries with no vested or limited vested interest, they can certainly do all these things. But there were also all these other countries, which it became clearer and clearer that they weren't really that interested in human rights and democracy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, okay. So there's considerably more nuance in the book in the way, because I had to foreshorten some of the things. But I mean, this aspect of China and Bandung not being a human rights, that's very clear. And there's an Australian historian called Roland Burke who's written about this, who says how rich it was on the human rights side, but specifically China were out and they were being criticized for that. So we know that nuance. And as I mentioned, some of the problematic countries, like an actor like Sékou Touré from Guinea, then I bring in a footnote say, this is what Sékou Touré did at home. Like, don't kind of, when he talks about the problem of freedom at the UN, then this is what he did at home. So I do try and qualify some of this specifically, but my main aim was to shift attention away from saying that their project was only dealing with racism, or with colonialism, or even with self-determination, saying that religion was a factor in this. This was actually something that they saw. And you asked about the agendas of Jamaica and Liberia. Were they successful? Well, to the extent that African jurists in the early 60s were interested in spiritual freedom of man, including behind the Iron Curtain. So this was not just a European agenda of the 70s. This was also a vision of some legal thinkers and scholars and even politicians in Africa wanting a different design of the world behind the Iron Curtain. In that sense, they pushed an agenda that became influential. And I just think it's important to bring this nuance forward. When I defended my dissertation, I had a historian and a law professor but self-determination was the key issue. That was the kind of thing I said, well, hang on a minute, it's really, really important, but there's also these other elements that we haven't given kind of a fair due. So, and especially for a lawyer, self-determination has kind of very strong implications when you deal with international law. But it has also, in a sense, overridden our attention to these richer nuances that there are, and that they ride these issues. And one aspect that I haven't touched upon is that there's a really, in parallel to these three elements that are up, there's also a very, very rich discussion about creating an international human rights system with mechanisms at the international, the regional, and the national level from around 63 to 68. And there, that's, for example, creates the special procedures where you start investigating a country level. And there, if you tell that story, you have to be able to say Tanzania was sovereignty focused, just want to deal with apartheid, but Senegal, with a very fine tradition of jurists, had a broader design. So it's allowing those nuances and not just kind of, because of course there's problems, and quickly many of these states, and that's the story in itself, when did they really completely disengage because they just showed their kind of authoritarian kind of thing. It's a short window, but it was really a critical window because it challenged the East and West in this kind of, in some ways I say that they gave a masterclass in human rights diplomacy, but that doesn't mean that the countries ended up having a very good human rights record. I mean, Philippines, their engagement died out, as I mentioned, when Marcos takes over. So yeah, okay, sorry. Any more questions? No? Okay, Daniel?
Yeah, I just want to follow up on what Geir Lundestad just said and make a twist in the question. So you talked a lot about the motivations, mm-hmm. and that we have to look at the single countries, the nation states, and that it's kind of a mixture between soft power issues and intrinsic motivations in the single countries. But is there a place for bloc solidarity of whatever kind in this story, like South-South solidarity? You mentioned Bandung, but also within the non-aligned movement or within the group of 77. Mm-hmm. Is there some kind of coherence in a pro-human rights argument?
Well, I think in terms of the G77 group, that would be more helpful in explaining the move away from this human rights diplomacy in the late 60s. So I wouldn't see that as a group that facilitates. It's simply other countries that become very dominant. There are a country like Algeria becomes very dominant in some of the G77 discussion. They became independent the same year as Jamaica entered the UN, and they had very different designs for kind of international relations and international order. So I wouldn't with the G77 group, but it's what is interesting in this part of this process, this is a malleable group that can be shaped, and this type of leadership that brings very strong agenda forward can have this alliance, and that gradually falls apart. But there is a Bandung influence in the late 50s coming into this process where they, for example, challenged the Khrushchev design on ending colonialism. And it's very clear that they have prepared well. And it's very clear that Bandung and some of these follow-up conferences in African countries are a point of reference by states from all continents at the UN. So there's this awareness on it. I'm not sure if that fully addresses your question, but I mean, they also just had different designs. Jamaica was not willing to go with radical solutions with kind of more like they said, we have to use these legal techniques, which also meant that sometimes they were different from many of the countries in the group that they were somehow trying to lead. So I think that's probably the best I can do. But I wouldn't rank G77 very high in this process. Asbjørn?
Happened during the 1960s. It's strange in a way that it has been possible to neglect it, because after all, very much happened in the 1960s. The Convention on Racial Discrimination is one thing, but the two covenants were also adopted, and that in itself was a breakthrough that they were accepted. Mm-hmm. So, I very much like the way you have shown how this use of human rights in politics then has a kind of a backside. Then you then also have to recognize that you have to look at your own backyard. And I think with regard to racism in particular, I think there was even much more interaction between the US civil rights movement and what happened in the United Nations at that time. And maybe there are even the same persons who had engaged on both levels. This was, of course, during the Lyndon Johnson period in particular, where things moved forward. But the more general question, we must remember that by 1960s, in Africa and in Asia, these were very new states. But as to regard China, of course, they had come through a period of a civil war. After, by the way, also a very long period of Japanese horrors. So, in a way, you could not really expect that these countries are organizing their societies according immediately to the kind of conception about rule of law in the way that we have become accustomed to in the West. So the more interesting question is, how much impact does it have over time? That is much more important. I mean, the fact that there were the Bandung conference, that there were at the States where things were not very much settled in these countries. But the question is, how can one see how the human rights, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is affecting over a longer period of time? And of course, for that purpose, we need to have a much longer history. But what you have done is certainly a very important contribution in bringing up this very important part of the history.
Okay, thank you. So just to comment on that, I think one of the first influences there that maybe the Universal Declaration had was in guiding the drafting of constitutions in newly independent countries. So by 1960-61, it's maybe 20-25 countries at least that have a Bill of Rights that is inspired by the Universal Declaration. And it's not just something that the British give them as an exit, it's also something that there's a real engagement on in some of these countries of designing a constitution that have these elements in it. And this is also why there is that maybe responsiveness in the early years of independence at the UN, kind of, because they have engaged in some of these issues. I think actually going back to Gaia's comment, I think, yes, it's not necessarily always the traditional human rights or individual freedoms that is strongly emphasized. It is for some, in some cases, but not in general for the bloc. I think maybe what human rights represented in this context was also a vision of equality. Of trying to design a new international system where these states that were weak, both in terms of the structures that Asbjørn just referred to in rule of law thing, but also in terms of economy and in terms of development potential, that if you could balance some of these things out by having rules and norms, then you could have a fairer system evolving. And that's why they engage so much on principles, both of human rights and the broader lawmaking. And of course that then challenges, because just having a vision of equality is not necessarily fully human rights compliant. But it's part of what carries this human rights agenda forward, and maybe also makes it easier to abandon later on when you shift to different trade agendas or new international economic order in the 70s. That at that level you can say it can be superficial, even though for some it was quite profound. But I don't think we should ignore the sense of the significance of this vision of equality carrying it forward. And that's still an important human rights dimension. But it plays a little bit different in terms of specificities of rights issues and so on. But there is a rich Bill of Rights tradition that informs some of the discussion in the early 60s and then gradually dies out. So, okay.
Well, we wouldn't be Norwegians if we let this run over time. We like to be precise. Please join me in a big round of applause for Stephen L. Jensen.
Thank you.
We have had a fascinating day, and I trust that we will see many of you when we reconvene on the 4th of May. That's a Wednesday, not a Thursday. And then James Cooper from Oxford Brookes University is going to address us on the topic of American presidents and peacemaking in Northern Ireland, which will of course dovetail with the presentation of Professor McNay last week. I hope to see you then.